Ladies and gentlemen, please fasten your seatbelts. We'll continue with Rich Smith. He'll be talking about novel protection. So give him a nice round of applause.
So, who am I? I work in the Trusted Systems Lab of Hewlett-Packard Research. I'm the lead researcher in their Threat and Offensive Technologies project. It's about 5 people in my team. It fluctuates with the amount of students that we have in at any time. I'm going to be speaking to you today about some research. It's about a year old now, actually. Talking about ways in which we can think, new ways in which we can think about security, and we're particularly applying it in this instance, exemplifying it with thinking about file format vulnerabilities and how we can address file format vulnerabilities. However, the actual theoretical basis for the work is applicable across the whole remit of security. So don't just think it as a particular defense against file format vulnerabilities. It's a technique. It's not a product. So I'm going to start off talking about the problem space which we're thinking about. I was speaking at the EU last week at the EU Commission, and I started with a joke there, and it bombed. Nobody laughed. 600 people out in the audience, not one laugh. I put it down to the fact that they weren't hackers, and it was a hacker joke, so they didn't get it. So I'm going to give it another go today, and if it bombs, I'm just going to have to accept it's a bad joke. So there's a hacker, and he's walking down a beach, sees a bottle in the sand, obviously picks it up, gives it a rub. Out pops a genie. And the genie says, hey, you get your 3 wishes, you know how this works, but I know you're a hacker, so I'm going to put an extra caveat in. Whatever you wish for, every other hacker in the world gets twice as much. And the hacker was like, well, 3 wishes, it's not so bad. So what do you want for the first wish? He said, well, I'd like a Superdome. And the genie was like, yeah, there you go, Superdome. It's in your data center, but every other hacker in the world got 2 Superdomes. And the hacker wasn't that pleased with this. So he had a little bit of a think. And the genie was like, come on, what do you want for your second wish? He was like, all right, I like some vulnerabilities in OpenBSD. I want some OpenBSD 0-day. Genie was like, there you go, it's on your Superdome, but every other hacker in the world, 2 OpenBSD 0-days. He wasn't that pleased with that either. So the genie was hurrying him. He was like, I want to get back in my bottle. What do you want for your third wish? So hacker stands there, thinks for a few seconds, and then goes, I think for my third wish, I'd really like to donate a kidney. It's just a bad joke, isn't it? But I'll come back to it because there's a little bit of a metaphor in there. So we're thinking about the problem space. And attacks are really moving, or have been gravitating towards client-side attacks for quite some time now. There was a peak of everybody hacking server-side stuff, when everybody was owning WFPD and SendMail, and then everybody thought they had that covered. A lot of people put effort into securing their server-side apps, firewalls, intrusion detection systems, etc., all your standard security stuff. So people moved towards the unprotected things, which are client-side attacks, and client-side attacks are now rocketing, and have been. There is, it's a prime target for real-world attacks, certainly against governments and corporations. We see a lot of them. Some are more sophisticated than others, but they are, they're a very, very real and everyday attack which is used. File format vulnerabilities are an example of one client-side attack. I'm sure everybody here is aware of what a file format vulnerability is. Malformed data being processed by a client-side program. And if you malformat data in particular ways, you may be able to take ownership of that program. There's been obviously an increase in fuzzing. I'm sure you've all heard many talks about fuzzing. The last couple of black hats, there's been a huge increase. I think at the last Black Hat in Vegas, there was an entire track dedicated to fuzzing. And file format vulnerabilities are great things to fuzz for. You just create a whole stack of files that are malformed in various ways, automatically load them into your program, see how the program reacts, and you may or may not find a vulnerability. And there's various fuzzes out there. There's file spike, not file spike, file fuzz, various other ones. targeted at different types of file formats, but you can there's quite a lot of attack surface area there to gain hold of. Down at the bottom there's a few just examples. A couple of the Microsoft ones. The cursor vulnerability was fun because it was a cursor. The WMF vulnerability was an example of a flaw as opposed to a bug, so it wasn't like a buffer overflow or anything. It was a feature of the file format which was being used in a way which probably wasn't expected. It's certainly by no means contained to Microsoft formats. Adobe had a nice one in their PDFs recently, which was a mail to bug for email addresses within that format. And I mean, literally a couple of days ago, EI released a whole heap of FLAC, which is an audio type format. They released a whole host of vulnerabilities on that. They were nice. They were cross-platform because the FLAC libraries work across all your platforms. There's the CVE numbers there if you're interested to go and find out slightly more about them. So, why are file format vulnerabilities particularly interesting to attackers? We've seen quite a lot of 0 days. Again, pulling out Microsoft Office, but it's not anything particularly bad about Microsoft. Microsoft Office is only targeted by the attackers purely because it's a ubiquitous format. If you're working in a corporation, everybody has Office on their desktop. So if you want to attack people, you need the reader, you need the client-side application there. You're almost guaranteed to have Microsoft Office at the endpoint in a corporation. And the Office formats are quite complicated. With complexity comes bugs, and that's why all the 0 days are there. We've seen, and I'm sure if you've been looking through the press, there's various targeted attacks used against corporations and governments through file format vulnerabilities. They're emailed in, they're very low bandwidth. Somebody will come up with a new attack or buy a new attack and send it in, so it won't come up on it won't be spam filtered because it's very targeted to particular people within the corporation. It won't be picked up by antivirus because it is a new attack, and we'll come along and have a quick talk about why signature-based approaches to this are less than optimal. But it is being used, and there's no secret that large corporations are seeing targeted attacks using file format vulnerabilities. It's one of the hotbeds of attack at the moment, and it's not an easy problem. Signature-based approaches, obviously, file formats would really fall into the remit of antivirus stuff, and antivirus do pick up on the signatures, but they, as we'll see on the next slide, they're not that good at it, unfortunately. And obviously, everybody does have antivirus on their endpoints, but it's even with known attacks and known vulnerabilities, completely excluding 0 day, with known attacks, it's still quite easy to get around an antivirus filter. This comes because in a file, you've got normally a few megabytes of space, of data space to play with. And if you're a wily attacker, then you can use all that space to your advantage. And file formats are often very flexible. They'll have legacy compatibility. So you can hide your attack in various ways, and you can encode your attack in various ways. So the antivirus solution really, from our research, hasn't been optimal in addressing this attack. It's been very much, they'll see an attack out there, they'll come up with a signature. You only need to tweak that attack slightly to get around the signature. Obviously, the paths into a corporation or into a government are numerous for email. You can direct your attacks to a particular person through email, so that's quite a nice reason why these are being used. And as I say, obviously we only have signatures for the stuff that we know about. So, there was a JPEG vulnerability. It's like 3 years old. It's not particularly impressive in any way. It was just your standard buffer overflow type of vulnerability. So I downloaded it. Your standard, go to Milworm, get some public script kiddie vulnerability and exploit information, and ran it through VirusTotal, which has 30-odd different virus engines, and it will tell you what every virus engine thinks that file is. So ran it through VirusTotal, and they came out pretty good. I mean, worryingly, for a public 3-year-old vulnerability, some stuff didn't actually find it a problem, but we'll forget that. But a vast majority, it came out as, JPEG exploit JPEG, blah, 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 blah. Great stuff. So 77% of the VirusTotal engines picked up that it was a problem file. Now, if we take that vulnerability, we use the same exploit code, and I just put it into a different picture, nothing more. Take that attack, embed it in a different picture. What are the results? Well, everybody came up the same, apart from ClamAV. I have no idea why, unless they were particularly, their signatures were pinned on the particular version of the attack that we were getting from Milworm. But everybody else, if they didn't detect it before, they still didn't detect it. If they did detect it, bar ClamAV, they came up with it. So that was kind of reassuring. So we went down to 74%. And then I went through and actually changed the attack slightly, understanding how the attack worked. I tweaked some bytes, swapped some bytes around, and quite a different picture. Only 5 of them picked it up. I haven't got the screenshot, I lost it, but I went further and got it down to only 2 of them picking it up by doing a little bit more tweaking. So it's actually quite simple to get around, certainly within file formats, and this was an exploit picked essentially at random. It was quite simple to get around a vast majority of the virus checkers out there. And like I say, with another 15 minutes work, I got it down to 2. Maybe if I put a little bit more time in it, I might be able to get around them all. Probably not, but certainly down to a level which you can be fairly sure you can get around. As I see Jeff at the back, I think it would be a good, a nice contest at Black Hat at DEF CON to have give people 5 vulnerabilities and access to VirusTotal and let them tweak the files to see how many, what time they can get to avoid all the.
Race to 0.
Yeah, race to 0. That would be, it'll be a good contest. So I'm not saying this should particularly surprise everybody, but it certainly illustrates the point that within the field of file format vulnerabilities, antivirus is it creams off the stuff that's public, or in not every case, but it should take out the noise. But if you've got a particularly determined attacker, they should be able to get around your antivirus signatures. So if we've understood the problem space, what would we like from a defense to answer this? Well, obviously, if we've got a known vulnerability using a known attack, so somebody downloading stuff from Milworm, we'd quite like to pick up on that. That would be, that would be the first tick in the box. It would be quite nice to have defense against a known vulnerability, but if somebody had worked on it a little bit to try and obfuscate it, if we can pick up on that, that would be a bonus as well. And then obviously the kind of the holy grail would be being able to defend against attacks that we don't know about, against vulnerabilities we don't know about, so 0-day. As we've discussed on the last slide, it's only the first one which is really addressed by antivirus, and it's not addressed that well. The other 2, I was speaking to a guy from Symantec, and he was very much insisting that his heuristics, their heuristics engine would pick up on this. Clearly it wouldn't, it doesn't. And there is some host IPS stuff which is looking at behavior. If you were opening a JPEG, should that JPEG really be able to open up some sockets? Probably not. So you can pick up on that behavior. So that they're potentials, but they won't cover everything. And we'll come into why IPS doesn't cover everything in a couple of slides' time. And the last point is kind of a personal preference for me. I'm not big on agent-based software defenses. If you have to have an agent installed on your own system, there's generally a better way to do it. You can do it at a server, at a proxy in the network. So if we can tick all these boxes and not have an agent-based solution, that's even better. So we need to protect against the known and the unknown, and a lot of people talk about 0-day defense. It's quite a big kind of hype and selling point. We protect against 0-day. And is it a holy grail? Well, for this particular bit of research which I'm showing, we've got some traction against some unknown threats. It's certainly not the entire answer. It's not a panacea. It's certainly not a product yet. It's still very, very much research. So we've made some tracks towards a solution. So Doppelgänger, which is the piece of research which I'm going to speak to you about. As I say, it's not a product. It's not anything that you can buy. It's more a approach to a solution. So I do work, obviously, for HP, but I'm not a HP salesperson. They just happen to pay me to do my research. So I'm not trying to say that it is the answer and it's a true way in light. It's just a different way to think and approach security. So the essence of Doppelgänger is really understanding and utilising the differences between data and information. And data and information is often used, the terms are often used interchangeably. People will say data and information in the same sentence, meaning the same thing, but essentially they are very, very different. I mean, people talk about information security a lot. Actually, a lot of the things that they're talking about is data security, not information security. So if we go down the little list, my definition of data is that it's a unit of fact. It's a non-divisible unit of fact. And information is a subjective interpretation of that fact. So if I'm sat in front of some data about rocket engines, I get a very different level of information from that data than a rocket scientist, because I don't know shit about rocket engines. The rocket scientist will be able to understand that data in a way which I can't. So the data set is the same, but the information gained from that is a subjective interpretation of that data. Now, that might seem obvious, but when you think about a lot of the defenses which are touted to people in information security, they're actually data security. And they're two very different problems. Information security and data security are very separate. And when you start differentiating between data and information and picking up when people are saying data when they mean information or vice versa, you start to get slightly more insight into what potentially we can do with the problem. So if we understand this differentiation between data and information, we understand that, and we've seen from various talks at this conference, attacks are very specifically crafted. They're not going through APIs. You've got to do some crazy little dance to construct the heap in a particular way and make sure that you land in the heap at the right point and unlink, or whether it's a buffer overflow, and if it's on a different service pack, you're going to need a different exploit than. Excuse me, if it's on one service pack to another service pack. So they're very particularly crafted, and it doesn't take very much to actually disrupt one of these attacks. Identifying the attack can be a problem, and that's why a lot of people have focused, is trying to identify when they're being attacked. And they're looking at the byte level. So they're looking at data, not information. And if we understand that attacks generally reside in the data, and certainly in file format attacks that's true, and users, when you execute a file to render it, for example, you don't care about the underlying data format. You want the information which that data format conveys to you. So a good way to exemplify this is with pictures. Pictures speak 1,000 words. So we've got a line on the left, a line on the right. Can anyone tell me the difference between the lines? The one on the left giving you a bit of a dodgy look. On the right, it's got a bad haircut. Anybody? Any differences? And when I've presented this, people have cried out with all sorts of crazy differences that I can't ever see.
One is a BMP, one is a JPEG.
Almost. So if we go, one's a PNG and one's a JPEG. So almost a BMP. But the point being, the underlying data structures to those two pictures are entirely different. But everybody still saw a line on the left, a line on the right, both giving you shifty looks with bad haircuts. The information portrayed by those images was exactly the same, but the underlying data format was different. So we can have different data which portrays the same information, which is quite key. And a lot of people can take a couple of cycles to think about that, but we can have entirely different data sets which you interpret in exactly the same way. So, obviously we can have different data that it portrays different information, absolutely, but we can have different data which portrays the same information. And if we remember that generally attacks live in the data rather than the information, they're very fragile, they're specifically crafted, and users are generally interested in the information in a file as opposed to the data. So with these things, maybe we can start to get somewhere. And there is a little caveat of the same information. Well, it's sufficiently the same that as users we can garner the same information from it. So If we disrupt a file's data while maintaining the information, we can probably nullify a lot of attacks. Well, not probably, I know we can because the programs which we've written prove it. We can nullify the attacks in a file format while actually maintaining its usability. And I'll go on to the maintenance of usability. So what can we change? Every file format has various attributes within that file format. So for example, the JPEG which is up there, you've got compression, luminance, color space, GIFs have palettes, etc., etc., etc. So every file has some attributes, and you can normally tweak them. So I could change the compression on a JPEG, and all the data kind of screws around because obviously I'm changing the lossy compression on that. And also we can swap from one type of file to another type of file. So I can go from a JPEG to a PNG. I can go from a PDF to a PostScript, or just a screen scrape of that image. Of that document. So in general, they're the two types. We can tweak file formats, and we can swap to a completely different format and then tweak its attributes. And in general, the transformations that we use on a file will be specific to that file format. So the transformations we can use on a JPEG file is very, very different than the transformations we can use on a PDF. So just some examples. Obviously, I've said luminosity and lossy compression. Compression, you've got to be careful about, because non-lossy compression or lossless compression, obviously when you expand it out, it's the same as went in. So if there was an attack in there and you losslessly compressed it, when it's uncompressed on the endpoint, the attack's still there, because the whole point of lossless compression is everything's still there. Lossy compression is, in this case, better. We can do, for text files, then we can obviously change the particular format. So we could go from Word to PDF. We could do a cross-family format. So that would be from, say, Word to JPEG. A screen scrape of that image. We can change the encoding, the versions, and there's always wacky formats. So PowerPoint, obviously it's an animated thing, so you can take it to a movie, you can take it to like a flash file. So every format does have its own changes which you can apply to it, but there's generalities which you can make across them. And for not 1 second are we saying that this is applicable to every file format. There are certainly file formats which you can't transform, or can't transform easily. Executables are a prime example of that. Transferring from an ELF to a Win32, it's a bitch, you don't want to do it. But then a lot of files have embedded code in them. Macros, for example, these are problems. So this is an approach, it's not a panacea. So if we're talking about the stuff we can change, which disrupts our data stream, we've got to think about the things that we stay the same, so we can maintain this kind of information equivalence. So we have an informational equivalence. Is do you gain the same amount of information from looking at or you're using that file? And there's also functional equivalence. As a user, can you use that file in the way that you would have used its pre-transform partner? So images are quite a good exemplar of this. If I had a JPEG and a PNG, can I do the same things with both of them? If we're talking about going from a Word file to a PDF, or a Word to a screen scrape image of that, obviously the functional equivalence is much, much lower, because I can't edit. If I have a screen scrape of that Word file, I can't edit the file. So it's conveying exactly the same information. It's got high information equivalence, but it's got very low functional equivalence. And depending on what use the person receiving that file is going to put the file to, maybe they want a higher informational equivalence, or maybe they want a higher functional equivalence, and it's entirely depending on their role and how they're using that file. So an example would be if somebody, you're collaborating on a project, and you're working on a document, there's no use me changing that file as it's coming through email to you to a JPEG image of that file, because you can't edit it and then send it back to the person. So you need functional equivalence. If you're an intercept officer working on intelligence data, as long as you can gain the same amount of information from the data, then you probably don't need to have that much functional equivalence in that file. So having a pictorial pictorial equivalent of a document is probably sufficient as long as it's clear enough that you can gain that same amount of information from it. So the role of the end user is key to the transforms which are applicable. And is entirely, within any organization there will be different users that have different requirements from their transforms. And in very, very general terms, if we're modifying attributes, say the compression on a file, we tend to hit the information equivalence a little bit more and maintain the functional equivalence because we're not screwing the file type. So anything you could do with the file before and after is the same because it's the same file type, but you've been screwing around with the attributes, so you generally take some hits on the informational equivalence. So maybe it's a little bit more of a blocky image or something. If we're switching between one file type and another file type, then you can often maintain a very high informational equivalence, but the functional equivalence is the part that takes the hit. And so depending on what it is that you're wanting to do with the file in the end, depends on kind of what modifications you want to make, and what is seen as a good transform will be different for every end user. So this is a kind of high-level example. We've got the line coming in its JPEG form, PNG form, whatever. We put it through some kind of transformation process, so we screw with the attributes. Maybe we change its file type, and then the file type it's gone to, we screw with those attributes. We've got some policy defining what it is that the good transformations are. So like I say, depending on what the end user wants, some changes will be good, some will be bad. That kind of feeds into what transformations we're going to make. And then we come out on the left and we'll go on to the actual process in a bit. We'll come out with a new version of that file, and it will be a non-predictable version of that file. If the file on the left was a good file, it was just a happy line, just a line JPEG, it will still come out as a good, happy line PNG. If it was a malicious file, then it could come out it will still look like a line in PNG form, but we'll have the attack kind of nullified out because we've shifted all the bytes around. Or it could very well just come out as absolute rubbish, it won't render. But if if it is an attack file, we don't really care whether it renders or not. The fact is that we've made ourselves safe from the attack which that contained. And the key point is that we don't necessarily know whether the line on the left had any attack code in it, because it could have some Dave Attell may have kind of worked overnight on it and just made the most malicious line in the world with some zero-day. We're not trying to detect any vulnerabilities, we're purely applying a process to it that we know is going to disrupt the attack while maintaining the information. If we can disrupt it and it won't render in its PNG form, we don't really care that much. Obviously, as an attacker, the first thing that you think about is attacking the process which has been put in place to defend. So, can we attack Doppelgänger? Well, certainly. We looked at this. If we were just doing very predictable transforms, so every JPEG that came in, we changed to a PNG using a standard, standard graphics libraries, then as an attacker I could send in a particularly formed JPEG that, knowing how you changed it to a PNG, I could construct an attack in the PNG through your change process. This is obviously something we've recognized, and that's why in the previous picture it's a non-predictable transform. So if you put if you sent the same line through the transformation process 10 times, you'd get a different transformed file out the end. So from an attacker's point of view, it's a non-predictable process, so I can't construct a file that, using the transformation process, will then make itself construct into an attack file. Obviously, also trying to actually own the environment which the transformations are taking process, which the transformation process is happening in, is going to be key. If I can own that environment, then I can change the transformation process or stop the transformation process entirely. So with those attack points, there's some additional requirements on this information data exchange. We want non-deterministic transformations, and we want to chain them. So we're not just going to be changing from one format to another format or changing the compression. We're going to do a series of changes, changing between different file formats and tweaking the attributes within them. And that's going to be a non-predictable chain with actually quite a high entropy space. We want the transformation process to be isolated. This is either done through sandboxes or virtualization. At the moment, the demos which we have run under Zen virtualization. We also, the aspect of virtualization is I can flick back to a known good state. I can just refresh to something that I know is safe. So even if somebody's got some super elite 0-day that's able to own my transformation environment, depending how paranoid I am, after one transformation, after 10 transformations, after 100 transformations, or after a day, or whatever period you want to put on it, I can transform back to a known good state of that environment. So even if you have owned it, I'll roll back to a state that it is now non-owned. And the period of your rollback is entirely dependent on how paranoid you are. And we're working on the environments which the actual transformations are taking place. They're also randomized as well. So randomized versions of the libraries, randomized operating systems, obviously using things like address-based randomization. So actually trying to own the environment is very much more difficult as well. So there's certainly those attack paths still present. We're working on addressing them. So talked about the data and the information and just the general approach to disrupting an attack pattern, even if we don't know what that attack is. What usage scenarios can we put in it? So email is the obvious one. Obviously, a vast majority of file format attacks propagate through email. So at the server, when somebody sends you various attachments, whether it's a Word file or a PDF or whatever, before you even download it from your Exchange server or your IMAP server, the server has transformed that file. And we'll go on to there's an illustration of that usage. Obviously, web content is another prime delivery mechanism for file format vulnerabilities. It certainly was the case in the WMF vulnerability a couple of years ago. So if most people in the environment use proxies, those proxies can do the transformation for the user, and it's fairly transparent. We've got a couple of examples of that. Another example, which I'm going to talk about in a second, is removable media. So whether that's CDs or USB keys, plug a USB key into your laptop and double-click on a file. The actual file which renders up isn't the file which is on the key. It's been transformed, and that happens in the example is actually in a parallel virtual machine. The virtual machine mounts the disk, and the transformation happens in that machine, and then it, through a special file system driver, you render a different version of that file. We'll go through that a little bit more in a second. The other couple of usages down at the bottom are really where people are able to fairly freely upload files. So on a lot of social networks, you can you have a picture of yourself, or say photo sharing websites. I can upload arbitrary data which people will look at. It's probably a fairly good idea if you're a host of arbitrary data to do some non-deterministic transformations on that data. So if there is anything in there, you'll nullify it. And there's various, we won't go into it, but there's various interesting laws around if you're hosting the data, are you liable for any damage done by that data? And it's a very, very much grey area of the law. It's probably, you don't want to be part of the first case law that goes to court, so it pays in mind to do transformations on that data and nullify any attacks known or unknown within that. And direct user input devices, I'm thinking of things like in The Chemist, where you take your camera's memory stick up, and you plug it in the side, and it brings up the pictures, and you choose which ones you want to print out. Obviously, they're just fairly standard PCs running on there. We've shown various examples that we can input memory sticks or whatever into those machines and take ownership of them. If you're having anything essentially where the user is supplying data to you, it's probably quite a good idea to perform transformations on that, maintaining the informational equivalence to protect yourself, because you don't know what it is that people are supplying arbitrary data. So this is the example of which I did have working until yesterday, but I broke it. Example of the file system driver. So if you were plugging in a USB key or a CD-ROM or anything, so this is kind of the user VM is what you'd normally be working within. The transformation VM is a little tight, quite hardened. It's running in Linux at the moment. Virtual machine that is only dedicated, all it does is transform files. It doesn't do anything else. Obviously VM0 is your management VM. And I'm not sure, people familiar with the Fuse file system for Linux? It allows you to write file system drivers in user space rather than having to get particularly down into the kernel. And there's various, like Ruby extensions and Python extensions and stuff. So this is all written using the Fuse kernel module, and all the file systems are written in Python. So you plug in, for example, your USB stick. The transformation VM hooks the USB stack, so it knows when there's been a new mass storage device entered into the system. It mounts that, it physically mounts that into the transformation VM, and then triggers up, actually through VM0 to the user VM, like a sudo. It flicks it to say that there's been a new USB device, but it kind of, the user VM doesn't actually really mount that USB device. And then using the Fuse file system driver, the user VM thinks it's mounted the USB device, but it's actually proxying all the syscalls that it would be doing on a normal file system. It's proxying that through over XML RPC through to the transformation VM. The transformation VM obviously has a daemon sitting on it that takes all those requests, and then that proxies the syscalls which are coming over XML RPC down to the actual real file system drivers, so the VFAT file system drivers, so it can read off the USB stick. Obviously that goes out through the hypervisor into the hardware. So when you request, for example, you double click on a .doc file, your requests will go into your, it's called Doppelfs driver. That's proxied through to your transformation VM. It then takes those proxied syscalls and takes them down to actual driver syscalls, opens that file, does non-predictable transforms on that file, and then returns the transformed file back over XML RPC to your file system space. So you think you've just opened, you'll double click on a .doc and you'll open up a PDF with various transforms that have happened on the attribute level. Now obviously that introduces a fair amount of overhead. It's not quite as quick as just clicking on a file normally. So we've done some work on actually kind of essentially pre-caching. So when the USB stick's inserted, the transformation VM kind of sits there and goes off and does all its transformation and has them in a big cache. And then when you request the data by XML RPC, it randomly chooses which of the transformation cache it's going to pull out and give back to you. So it happens very much faster. And we're starting to think about things within that kind of transformation file cluster. So we've got a whole smattering of different files which you may get back. We're starting to look at things like kind of where the request's coming from, what your usage of the particular file may be. So for example, the context in which you want to use that file, so the information which you're wanting to gain from that file will determine which of the file clusters in the transformation VM will be returned to you. It will still be non-deterministic, but there'll be a preference ordering in the non-deterministic list. I probably haven't explained that very well. Hopefully that's kind of clear what's happening with the picture. Another example is the email. So the email comes in, to the Exchange server. The Exchange server takes the attachment and encrypts it. Obviously, an encrypted file, it can't attack anything, so we just store it off in an encrypted store. We do a transformation, and obviously this is just kind of like, the random document modifier, which is quite a grand term. We screw around with the file, and then when you request that file over Exchange, what gets returned to you is a modified version. The policy, and I don't particularly, any security mechanism which is heavy on policy, I'm not a massive fan of, but policy here really means the usage of a person. So, for example, a secretary and a researcher have very, very different usage models for how the stuff that's coming in for email, they use the stuff coming in on email. So it'll be kind of a very, very coarse policy, and all it does is determine which are good and bad transformations for that particular person. And obviously there's an audit trail, and then you get a different document out the end when you download your email. Now, if for any reason you need the particular, the original version of that file, obviously it's been encrypted away, so we haven't lost the original. It's essentially an out-of-band mechanism to say why it is that you need that original as opposed to the modified version of that file. So it just goes through your normal kind of through your security officer. Now this example was very much, we've got kind of a proof of concept system working, and it's quite militant in its way of having to kind of request the original through channels of authority. But for the people that we designed it for, that fits. It was a government agency that fits in very well with their general usage pattern anyway. So this is why it's quite kind of rigorous in that sense, but it fits in with how they use their systems anyway. So obviously there's limitations. It's far from a complete and kind of panacea solution. It's very much still experimental. We're still playing around a lot with the ideas of information and data and how can we gain security advantage from that. As I've said already, it doesn't deal with macros, it doesn't deal with embedded code, it doesn't deal with executables. Social engineering is an example of an attack which doesn't sit in the data, it entirely sits within information, so clearly it doesn't address that. And when we've been taking it out to people, they often see it as a solution to all their problems, but it's only a solution to a problem which is in its current guise that file formats come into. So it doesn't any user input. It doesn't filter that. It can't be a defense against that. Another facet of this technique is because we're not actually looking for any attacks. We're kind of nullifying. We're just sheep dipping data to get to take out to disrupt any attacks within it. We don't actually know whether we're under attack at the moment or not. So whereas if you're doing intrusion detection, like IDS, IPS, or antivirus stuff, you get notified if they found an attack. You get notified, and if obviously you've been notified of a lot of attacks, you know that you're particularly under attack or being targeted by somebody. With this technique, you get no intelligence on whether you're under attack or not. It's purely you're using the data information equivalence to nullify and disrupt the attacks, but you don't actually know whether you have or whether you haven't. So you haven't got any intelligence on whether you're under attack at the moment. As I said, kind of the policy in real world usage, how good your policy is on what transforms are acceptable and what transforms are unacceptable really will determine whether the system is useful to you or not. If you have a bad policy, then the system will be very anti-user friendly. And in reality, we're not going to transform absolutely every single file format which comes in, because that's silly. We're going to just we're just going to hit on the main ones. Attacks generally come in, certainly your Office formats, multimedia files and image files and sound files, mainly because they're quite complex formats that people think they understand, but they often don't, and they have a lot of features within them and legacy features within them to maintain compatibility. And that's generally where you can, if you're constructing attacks, that's generally where you can really get quite a lot of leverage on finding some new attacks. So it would be a small number of file formats which would be addressed by this, but certainly those small number of formats is where the attacks generally reside. We won't be transforming crazy CAD file formats, because the attacks don't generally live in them. Certainly not to say that they can't live in them, but it's just they generally don't. And the work with the Doppelfs, which was the first picture I showed you, there's still quite a lot of work to actually get it working better with Zen. It's quite hacky at the moment. It will improve over time. We did have a version working with VMware, but we decided to concentrate on the Zen just because we had the source and we could tweak the USB stuff within Zen much better. So in summary, hopefully I've kind of at least sparked in your mind that data and information aren't the same. They shouldn't be used interchangeably, and most of the things which people are talking about in information security, they're actually talking about data security. So when you listen to other people's talks, think about when they're saying data and information, do they mean data, or are they not really understanding the difference between data and information? A key concept is that you can have different data that portrays the same information. Hopefully I've got across that it's a technique, it's not it's not a shrink wrap product, it's not a panacea to all your problems, it's just a new way to think about approaching security. I've exemplified it by using file formats and file format vulnerabilities, purely because it's quite a nice space that isn't particularly addressed at the moment, but the technique certainly isn't confined to just working with file format vulnerabilities. It can be used in a host of other situations. And it's research which is ongoing with the concept of information and data and how we can get security advantage from that, as well as we're very much an attack-based team, so we've been using understanding the difference between data and information to come up with some quite interesting new attacks. So it can be used both ways. A lot of people who are implementing defense are defending the data but not the information. So it is an avenue for both improved defense and opportunities for offense. So kind of be aware of that. And yeah, research is ongoing. I'm by far from saying this is kind of a done and complete thing. This is just kind of some ideas that we have in progress. So that's pretty much all I have. If people have questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
Please be aware, if you want to ask questions, raise your hand so we can get the microphone to you, because we're doing live recording. Any questions? Well, then give him a nice round of applause, because he has been doing really great.